All right, D. Oh, I need to connect my headphones. Okay, let's play King's Indian. Okay, we're going to play King's Indian defense. Now, the King's Indian defense, as I've explained many times, the point is that you basically give up control of the center, and in return, you develop pieces to attack the center from a distance. In order to make the King's Indian work properly, you need to first complete your development quickly, so let's castle. And now the time has come to, well, the knight from f3 defends the pawn on g4. So what comes to mind in terms of attacking that pawn on d4, directly or indirectly? There's several ways of accomplishing this. You could play bishop g4, right? You could trade this bishop for the knight and soften up white's defense over the d4 pawn. This is not a typical King's Indian move, but it does illustrate one of the key themes. Now, a lot of people here would take the knight, but there's no hurry. Because we have the knight pinned, we could take him at a moment of our convenience. Thank you, Hishalina, for the raid. So how should we continue to press on this pawn on d4 with our pieces in the spirit of this line? Which is to use pieces to pressure the center from a distance. c5 is possible. We can strike with the pawn. But let's use our pieces. Thank you so much, Hishalina. Hi, Selena, for the 75 party raid. He's castled. So he simply ignores the threats that we have posed on his center. So we can take on d4. Because of the pin, he cannot take back. And he's essentially busted. He lost the central pawn. And now he makes matters worse by taking on f6. Now, if we were extra fancy here, what would we do in this position? We can take on f6 with the bishop. We can take back. But what intermediate move can we also consider making? Yeah, so a lot of you guys got caught in the trap. When you make a move such as knight takes f3, you have to calculate it. When you make an intermediate move, you have to calculate it. If you play knight takes f3, you allow gf. Now that pawn from f3 is going to attack the bishop on g4. And we're going to lose a piece. So believe it or not, we play bishop takes f3. He plays pawn takes f3. He doesn't attack anything. Now we can take on f6, and we have ruined the structure around his king. Now we are also up a pawn. His king side is ruined, and we can exploit either the first thing or the second thing. It really depends on what we want to do. Now, one approach that a lot of people struggle with is the queen side attack. It's hard for black to do anything specific on the king side yet. But we're going to keep that in mind unless you guys have any ideas in terms of activating pieces, and you guys do, which is queen d7. Now, there was also an idea of pressuring the queen side, but let's go for the brute force approach. Let me just write this down, especially because he's ignored completely the threats. So what do we do here? What do we do in this position? Yeah, we win as queen because there's no stopping checkmate on h2. Bishop e5, by the way, would have been worse, and very important to indicate that in such situations, there's often only one correct option, and you have to operate under that assumption. Okay, so let's see. Tommy, queen takes f1, exactly. Okay, he's resigned. Okay, so first things first, why is the move bishop e5 worse in this position? Why does this not lead to checkmate? Inevitably checkmate on h2. It is worse because white can play f4. Now, you have to remember a very crucial thing. I call this the 3 ways of stopping a threat. And numbers 2 and 3 people forget about all the time. Let's say that a piece or a pawn is threatened. You're attacking a knight, you're attacking a pawn. What are the ways of defending against this threat? The first is to move that piece or that pawn and to shift it to a different location. Sorry, the 4 ways to defend against a piece or a pawn. You move it to a different location. Okay? Obvious. The second is to defend it with another piece or a pawn. So those 2 methods are very obvious to people. But the third and the fourth are not. The third is to intercept one of the attackers. I think it's called interference. So you interfere with the bishop's control over h2. And then the fourth, what is most commonly forgotten about, is setting an EST, equal or stronger threat, by which you refer to a threat that obviously is equal in value or even stronger. So if your knight is attacked and you respond to that threat by attacking your opponent's queen, you are setting an EST. And every time one of your pieces or pawns is threatened, you don't need to go down the checklist and like see, okay, can I apply method 3? Can I apply method 4? Generally, the solution presents itself intuitively. But if you're in a situation where you don't see a defense against the threat, remember to kind of look under the third and fourth categories, because there you can find some stuff that otherwise your brain would not have indicated. Okay, method 5 is resign. Method 5 is just to not move the piece and just to allow it, obviously. But I'm mostly talking about parrying the threat. Okay, now in terms of the game itself, I've already introduced King's Indian concepts. Now, in the mainline King's Indian, generally black plays the move e5. And you will see this, for example, in the main line of the King's Indian, which is referred to knight f3, castles, bishop e2. This is called the classical variation, or the main line. Black plays e5 to strike in the center. And this is not a pawn blunder, because if white takes twice on e5, then the King's Indian bishop comes into play. And what is the way to win the pawn back? With interest. The King's Indian hinges on this very tactic working. Otherwise, the whole King's Indian would be invalidated. Knight takes e4, exposing the attack on the knight. You might study this position carefully and say, wait a second. We have a situation with two hanging pieces. I have talked about this situation before. In a situation where you have two hanging pieces, you need to look for a desperado with one of the pieces, where you give that piece away for as much as you can, and then you take the other piece. So here the move knight takes f7 comes to mind. It seems to win a pawn. Because if you now take this knight, then white will take yours, and white will be up a pawn. But the reality is knight takes f7 loses a piece. It loses a piece because black has an intermediate move. Or more precisely, two intermediate moves, but one of them is the more meaningful one. Can anybody spot how black wins a piece here? Yeah. You simply play bishop takes c3. Now you can swap the queens just to eliminate the fluff. You take the knight, and then this knight on e4 is unharmed. So this is actually a very important variation that justifies the existence of the King's Indian. So here you might ask, why did I not play e5? And if you compare this position to this position, you'll see that instead of the bishop on e2, there is a bishop on g5. That bishop is creating a potential pin. This pin becomes a reality if I play e5, and this is a very unpleasant thing to allow, because very simply, white can play knight d5, or white can even play bishop takes f6, knight d5, and white wins, because it's a fork on f6 and on c7. Black cannot save both things at the same time, and he is losing. So that is why you have to be very flexible in the opening. You cannot put your head down and dogmatically make the same moves regardless of your opponent's opening scheme. You have to look at what he's played, and you have to decide accordingly what you play. So that's why we decided on bishop g4, knight c6, a more concrete approach, piece-based approach toward attacking d4. Yes, Azazi, if you landed in this situation, you were trying to make the most of it, you would take on d5. And you can try to coordinate your pieces, although this is very bad because white also gets his rook to c1, and so his rook also has immediate prospects. Okay, so for that reason, e5 is bad, and so we decided to do this. Now he castled, that was very bad. He should have probably played d5, as Babzin is indicating, and then I would have played knight e5. And remember to always, exploit the pin. I mean, otherwise, why are you pinning your opponent's pieces? And if he drops his bishop back to e2, we can take on f3. Now, if he takes with a bishop, he drops a pawn, so he has to take with a pawn. And now, he's basically really permanently weakened both his king side and his center. and we can play c6 and deploy the queen through b6. We have a very, very good position here. And a very big initiative because white has nowhere to castle. If he castles kingside, his kingside is ruined. If he castles queenside, then the bishop on g7 is going to be incredibly powerful, and it's going to be a very strong agent of attack. Okay, so this is very good. Now he blundered a pawn. We made this intermediate move to ruin his kingside, and then the last thing to talk about is if we did not want to play on the kingside, and we wanted to play on the queen side, how could we have done that? Well, in order to think about playing on the queen side, people, what I think people should do is think of attacks on the king and attacks on the queen side in a similar way. When you think about attacking the king, often you think about a pawn storm. You think about pawns advancing forward and provoking weaknesses in the opponent's position. And it's much the same with a queenside attack, except it can be a little bit harder to prepare these pawn moves. Hey, hi Selena. And in this case, the move c6 comes to mind. The idea of c6 is to play a6 and then to play b5, expanding on the queen side. So it's sort of like a queenside pawn storm, except it takes a little bit longer to prepare. Yeah, so it's a typical idea in the King's Indian, actually, because, you'll see it in many different types of positions. Okay, so this would have also been very possible, and combined with the extra pawn, black is in terrific shape here. Any questions? Yeah, the King's Indian is not that hard to learn on an initial level, but it's very hard to master. Thank you, Tantwa. I'm very happy to hear that. Thank you for the sub, man. Okay, guys, one last game because I'm exhausted. I do have a recommendation for opening theory. I imagine that most of you happen to own a copy of the recent... This is a recent book, the Handbook. It's a recent book. It's in German, but I recommend it so much. I think you should get it, even though it's in German. It's pretty recent. It's got analysis of the Philidor. It's got a lot of analysis, actually. Zuckertorg did call it outdated yesterday, but... oh, there's Steinitz mentioned. But they made a new copy. Anyways, okay, so let's play. This is the Handbook of Openings. So it's an opening book that was originally published in like 1870, and I have the edition republished in like 1910. So yeah. Anyways. Potential endgame scenarios. Yes, I'm happy to. I'm happy to talk about endgame scenarios. And I can do like a separate unit on that, on like basic checkmates or like basic endgames. But I've always felt that like that's pretty well covered in chess literature. But if it's not, then I'm happy to cover it. So it's the sort of thing that I assumed you can find stuff on like basic endgames. And my one sort of precondition is I don't want to do stuff that's like been done before well by other people. I don't want to steal their thunder. Well, I appreciate that, Phillipsburg. Knight plus bishop mate, of course I can cover. But that is actually pretty difficult to explain in a systematic way, but I think I have a way to do that. It's called the Handbuch des Schachspiels. Okay, let's play one more game then. No, I would recommend Queen's Gambit initially, and then King's Indian maybe like 1300 plus. Yeah. Okay. So we have been playing the Accelerated Dragon in our latest couple of games in the speedrun. Bishop c4, we already know how to meet this pretty well, Ziggy. And we meet this by playing e6, blunting the bishop and preparing to go d5, expanding in the center. Why not just get an English translation? Dude, I was kidding. It's a historical artifact, man. There's no English translation of this 150-year-old book. So now we can just castle. Very simple developmental moves. Okay, so he goes d4. So this guy's kind of good. But there's no reason we should take the pawn. I mean, let him be the one to take our pawn. Then our bishop can come out to c5 and skewer his king. So where should this bishop on c8 go? Tickle, tickle mother. Where should this bishop from c8 go? It should go to g4 in order to pin the knight to the queen. And now what should we do? We'll just take and go knight d4. So obviously pins are great and you want to keep them, but if you can win like a central pawn, that usually takes priority. And now let's go after this bishop for a second. Hey, Gaines. Well, and the reason I took is just to win the pawn. I mean, I'm not doing anything mysterious. I'm just winning a pawn. Now, we would love to go c4. And I actually miscalculated this detail, but queen takes d4 picks off the knight. I know some people are thinking of c4 probably. That's all good, Charles. You're welcome. You're always welcome. So, how do we go about fixing the situation? Well, one option when we mess up is just to sort of make a move that improves our position from a general perspective. We don't have to do anything. There's no threats. So can we bring one of our pieces into the game? Okay, and it's a typical move. We make this move all the time. We bring this particular piece in the game all the time. Queen b6 drops the bishop on e7. So we would go rook e8. Good job. And that's something that I advise to people, to stabilize the situation when you've made a mistake by making a general improved move. He's made a blunder. I didn't stop to explain it, but we take on b3, and after he takes back, what's the next move? He's put his pieces on forkable squares. We can go d4 and win his bishop or his knight. And we're going to be a full piece up, and the game is going to be over. And he resigns. Simply good. Nice and short. So everything was very simple. We've had this many times before. We just developed our pieces. Bishop h5 would have been possible to keep the tension, but we decided to go after the pawn instead. And we decided to go after the pawn instead, which is totally sensible. Now I actually miscalculated. I thought I had c4, winning the bishop, but he does take the knight. So rather than panicking, we just made a general improving move, waited for him to feed us the rope to hang himself. Yeah, the pawn on d5 can be hard to defend, which is why we're basically going for active development. If he takes, then we want to circumvent the weakness of the pawn by attacking all of his vulnerabilities, including the pin, including the pawn on f2. And this is actually a nasty position for white to play, particularly in blitz, because black has a lot of clearly defined ideas, whereas white really doesn't. So that's sort of the lay of the land.